Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my running back rankings for the 2019 fantasy football season. So, on today's episode, I'm going to be going through my top 12 running backs in half-point PPR scoring formats in order to kind of meet you guys in the middle. For those of you who play full PPR and standard, I decided to pick half PPR as I usually do. So I'll talk about my top 12 players. I understand it's a little early. We're sitting here in May, but I thought, I'd give you guys an idea of where I sit at the running back position, who I think is going to be the best of the best going into the 2019 season. So before we get into that, I want to remind you all, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Now, it might not be easy for some of you who've come around this channel for quite some time. Maybe you're new to the channel. I'm going to ask you, okay? I'm going to challenge you to try to pass rush past David Bakhtiari, left tackle for the Green Bay Packers, and try to get your cursor to that subscribe button. Yes, I know it's difficult for some of you, but hey, I would much appreciate it for you to subscribe. And if you'd like more content, it's definitely going to be coming out from this channel. So anyway, let's get into the agenda. Hey everybody, how's it going? All right, we're talking about my rankings. Now, as per usual, many of you know from last season, rankings are always subject to change. And again, we're in May, so these are not definite, these are not final. You may see a player that you believe should be ranked higher. Go down in the comment section. Let me know what you guys think. Where do you kind of have your top 12 running backs for this coming season? But anyway, let's talk about number one. Let's talk about Saquon Barkley. Now, here's the thing about Saquon Barkley. He is the best running back as of right now. Last season, had 2,000 all-purpose offensive yards with about 1,300 plus rushing yards, 700 receiving yards, 15 offensive touchdowns, in which he also had 121 targets, 91 receptions. When it comes to any sort of PPR scoring format, I mean, Saquon Barkley was leaps and bounds more impressive than we all anticipated last season. To be honest, being a part of the New York Giants offense, I did not expect Saquon Barkley to be so special last year. But he was nothing else but special. Last season, he had 13 RB1 performances. Now, an RB1, as many of you know, but if you don't, an RB1 is a top 12 running back. So in 13 of his 16 games, he was ranked in the top 12 when it comes to his performances. That's ridiculous. He's consistently putting up, 20 plus points a week in fantasy. Last season had 340 total points in half-point PPR scoring formats. On top of it, Saquon Barkley last season had 14 games in which he had 100-plus rushing and receiving yards in 14 different games. That's pretty ridiculous. Saquon Barkley, he's a stat machine. He is going to rack up fantasy points for you, and that's why he's my number one running back. Now, many of you may be thinking, is Eli Manning going to be a starting quarterback? Are they going to, because they drafted Daniel Jones at the 6th overall pick in the 2019 draft, where are they going to go? Are they going to, go with old faithful Eli Manning, or are they going to kind of shift the offense towards Daniel Jones and get him more reps earlier on in the season? As of right now, we don't have an idea of that. Training camps have barely gotten started at all. It's not even the mandatory ones. We're talking about the optional training camp. So not too much information about that, but as of right now, even with whether it's Eli Manning or Daniel Jones, I have enough confidence to say that Saquon Barkley is the number one running back coming off the board if I have the number one overall pick. It really didn't even matter last season. Without Odell Beckham, with Eli at quarterback, Saquon Barkley was still a consistently good running back. And many of you may be thinking, defenses are going to key in on Saquon Barkley. They're going to make sure that they stack the box. Well, they already did that last season. He saw many stacked boxes on a consistent weekly basis, and he was still able to produce. The New York Giants, they've brought in more offensive linemen. They got Kevin Zeitler, Pro Bowl offensive guard. They're going to build this team around Saquon Barkley. No matter who's at quarterback, I still have a lot of confidence in him. That 121 targets, he's practically the number one wide receiver on this team. Especially with Odell Beckham now gone. He's going to see a lot of targets out of the backfield, which presents a lot of fantasy value. Now, before I move on with Saquon Barkley, I also want to mention, in videos past, I always talk about running backs and their red zone rushing attempts. I think it's extremely valuable to kind of nitpick in that specific stat because that's where you find a lot of fantasy value. Getting those red zone touchdowns, getting the opportunity down in the red zone presents a lot of fantasy value. And, just this past season in 2018, the top 5 running backs in red zone rushing attempts were the top 5 running backs in fantasy football last season. So it says a lot when it comes to red zone rushing attempts. So before I move on, I want to talk about Saquon Barkley's red zone rushing attempts last season. He had the 3rd most rushing attempts in the red zone compared to all players last season, in which he had 50 attempts for 7 rushing touchdowns. And then he also had 11 receptions for 3 receiving touchdowns. 10 touchdowns just coming from the red zone because he's seeing the ball at an accelerated rate. As a New York Giant, he saw 70% of the rushing attempts in the red zone compared to all running backs, quarterbacks who had rushing attempts. And, that just bodes well for Saquon going into 2019. So I could talk about him for 40 minutes, but we're going to move on. We're going to talk about number 2, Christian McCaffrey. Now, this might be a surprise. This entire list might be a surprise to many of you. I've heard people throw Alvin Kamara in the top 2. I've heard Ezekiel going number 1. But I honestly believe Christian McCaffrey has to be in the conversation for a top 2 running back in the 2019 season. Therefore, I have him there. Last season, over 1,000 rushing yards, over 850 receiving yards. But the magical stat was he had 124 targets and 107 receptions, in which he broke Matt Forte's receptions for a running back in a singular season record. Goodness gracious, he was fantastic last season. 13 total touchdowns, 334 fantasy points as the number 2 running back in half-point PPR last season. Christian McCaffrey was incredible, and he was one of the most consistent backs. And he got better as the season progressed. Earlier on in the season, he had some pretty good double-digit performances here and there. But in the second half of the season, from weeks 9 on to 17, even though he didn't play in week 17, he played a little bit because the season was over. They didn't really have to force him to play. Even then, from weeks 9 through 17, he led all running backs in fantasy points. The guy was an absolute monster. And you have to take that into consideration because Cam Newton did not play 2 of those games late on in the back half of the season. And that makes a pretty big difference because you can key in on these rookie quarterbacks, you can stack the box, and you can give them hell. Yet Christian McCaffrey out of the backfield continued to find fantasy value. Last season, he had 11 RB1 performances. Goodness gracious. Christian McCaffrey, there's no going wrong with him. There's no going wrong with a lot of these running backs, especially like in the first tier, the top 4. But personally, the only questions I have, we talked about Saquon and whether the quarterback situation is going to hurt him. In my opinion, it's not really going to make a big deal. But how about Christian McCaffrey's situation? Does his quarterback situation hurt him? Is Cam Newton healthy? Is this offense capable of enough to present enough fantasy value for Christian McCaffrey? To that, I say yes. I think in the division that they currently play in, the NFC South, that is one of the highest scoring fantasy divisions, and we all know that. The New Orleans Saints, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Atlanta Falcons, and the Carolina Panthers, those teams are consistently in shootouts with one another. And Christian McCaffrey proved that with last season. The amount of points he was putting up against the teams within his division that he can play twice a year, goodness gracious, he was fantastic. Talking about his red zone rushing attempts last year, had the 4th most amongst all running backs. No surprise because he was one of the top. 46 rushing attempts for 7 rushing touchdowns. So to take that into account, every single one of his rushing touchdowns last season came in the red zone. Nothing outside of it. Now, the only concerns I may have on Christian McCaffrey in the red zone is the fact that Cam Newton can run the ball. And, the last couple seasons, Cam Newton's been taking 4 rushing touchdowns, 6 rushing touchdowns, 5 rushing touchdowns in the red zone. And that's going to hurt Christian McCaffrey a little bit, right? But I don't think he is dependent of those specific stats. I don't think that Christian McCaffrey 100% needs that work to be as viable as he's been. He gets a lot of work in the passing game. He's practically a wide receiver too, just in his receiving. Actually, looking at his receiving stats, he's probably a low end, a wide receiver 1, high end wide receiver 2, just with his receiving stats. He's ridiculous. On top of that, in the red zone, he had 14 receptions for 5 touchdowns. So again, of his 13 touchdowns this season, 12 of them came in the red zone, which is extremely important for Christian McCaffrey. I know many people may be thinking, he's a smaller running back. He can't take the hits. That entire theory dissolved last season. He proved to everyone it doesn't matter. In the offseason, he's looking jacked. He's looking ready. And he's my number 2 running back going into this season. All right, number 3, Ezekiel Elliott. Now, many of you may be thinking Zeke should be number 1. I understand your point. And there's an argument for it. I'm not going to say that there's not an argument for it, but I personally don't think that Zeke should be taken that high. Now, last season, over 1,400 rushing yards, almost 600 receiving yards, 9 total touchdowns, 290 fantasy points, and the number 5 running back last year in half-point PPR. Now, here's the thing. Ezekiel Elliott's season completely shifted on a dime as soon as Amari Cooper came into this offense. Now, that's pretty much going to be the main argument going from here on out for everyone ranking Ezekiel Elliott as a number 1, 2, 3 running back. What he did in the second half of the season as soon as Amari Cooper came in was just ridiculous. Prior to Amari Cooper, Ezekiel Elliott was averaging 16.27 fantasy points per game in a half-point PPR scoring format. And he was having a decent season. Then what happened? Amari Cooper came in, this offense expanded. It gave Dak Prescott more of an ability to open up this offense and get this team moving. On top of that, it opened up Ezekiel Elliott to be, worked into this passing offense more than he's been in his entire career. In the second half of the season alone, 59 targets, 52 receptions for 5 receiving touchdowns. That's pretty ridiculous. 5 total touchdowns, excuse me. Not receiving touchdowns. That would be a mistake. But in the second half of the season with Amari Cooper on team, 22.36 fantasy points per game is what he averaged. So nearly, 6 points per game more. That's a touchdown practically, right? So a lot of improvement we're seeing in the second half of the season, and a lot more targets. That's the thing that a lot of people were saying. If Ezekiel Elliott, yes, he can touch the ball 350 times a season. We've seen him do it. But the thing is he going to see a lot of work in the passing game? Because those half-point PPR, receptions here and there, they rack up and they score a lot of fantasy points for you. So a lot of the concerns last season was, is Ezekiel Elliott capable of getting work into the passing game? We saw him find 77 receptions on 95 targets last season, which was fantastic. A big boost from seasons prior. Now, why do I have him number 3 comparatively to the 2 guys above him? Now, all 3 of these guys, they don't have anybody lurking behind them. I understand, the Carolina Panthers, they drafted a running back to sit behind McCaffrey. He's not going to dig into much of his work. I think these 3 running backs, compared to everybody else on this list, they're just clear number 1s, and they're not going to have anybody dig into their fantasy potential. Ezekiel Elliott specifically, the only way that his potential is ever ruined, similar to Christian McCaffrey, why I have them at 2 and 3 instead of number 1, is the fact that Dak Prescott in the red zone is killing him. He is absolutely killing a lot of fantasy value for Ezekiel Elliott in the red zone. The ability to run the ball as a quarterback, it presents an extra, option down in the red zone, and that's exactly what Dak Prescott has done. For the last 3 seasons as the Dallas Cowboy, Dak Prescott has scored 6 rushing touchdowns. Every single rushing touchdown Dak Prescott has scored has been in the red zone. And that takes away from Ezekiel Elliott's total fantasy value. Imagine having, an extra 6 rushing touchdowns for Ezekiel Elliott. Yes, then he becomes the number 1 running back, given without a doubt. But because of the fact that Dak Prescott, on a consistent basis, each of the last 3 years, has scored 6 rushing touchdowns from the red zone, it makes a pretty big difference on Ezekiel Elliott's fantasy performance. It's 36 points right there that's taken away from him. That being said, he's still my number 3. He's still one of the best in that top tier of running back. Really, these top 3, there's no going wrong with either of them. Talking about red zone stats, he had 39 rushing attempts for 5 rushing touchdowns, 12 receptions for 2 rushing touchdowns. So 7 of his 9 total touchdowns found in the red zone. Well done, but he's my number 3. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about Alvin Kamara really quickly. Alvin Kamara. Now, in my opinion, that first tier of running back is the top 3. Now, Saquon, McCaffrey, and Ezekiel Elliott, for those of you out there, tell me what your order would be as a top 3 running back. Hit me up in the comment section. Let me know. Because to be honest, I think that's the first tier. Then moving on from then, I know Alvin Kamara, I think he kind of sits alone in that second tier because of his ability in the passing game, on top of the fact that the amount of touchdowns he had last season. But either way, Alvin Kamara, he sits outside of that because of the fact that the New Orleans Saints, they consistently have gone with a 2 running back scheme since Alvin Kamara has come into the league in 2017. When he came into the league, him and Mark Ingram pretty much ran that 2-headed monster kind of scheme. And we saw a lot of Drew Brees' passing attempts, passing yard, and a lot of his fantasy points kind of dwindle because of the fact that they have keyed in on running the ball so consistently. Last season, Alvin Kamara, he had more of an opportunity to kind of have the backfield for himself. Mark Ingram was suspended for the first 4 games of the 2018 season, which forced Alvin Kamara to have the backfield for himself. I'm sure they had a couple other running backs that they signed, came in, touched the ball a couple times, but in weeks 1 through 4 last season, it's pretty important. You ready for this? In weeks 1 through 4 last season, Alvin Kamara averaged 28.65 fantasy points per game when he was the lead back and there was no Mark Ingram in the backfield. 28.65 fantasy points. Okay, in 4 weeks, that's how much he averaged per week. Alvin Kamara came out of the gate hot, right out of a catapult, cannonball, doesn't matter. The dude was absolutely ridiculous in the beginning of the season. Now, as soon as good old Mark Ingram came back, it shifted back to the good old days, right? Obviously, Alvin Kamara continues to see more touches because of his versatility and the fact that they're so confident with him. He's going to be the RB1 of this team. That's a given. Even when Mark Ingram was here with the New Orleans Saints last season. But my concern is, okay, now that you have Latavius Murray, who's practically a budget Mark Ingram, right? He is a cheaper version of Mark Ingram. He's the same type of running back. You can work him early downs. You can have him, touch the ball here and there. He's going to have 100 total carries, Latavius Murray is this season. And that's going to hurt Alvin Kamara. And that's why I have him at number 4. Having another running back in the backfield, it does not help you. Now, talking about Alvin Kamara, statistically, last season, 880 rushing yards, over 700 receiving yards. Now, the big stat was 18 total touchdowns, 14 on the ground and 4 through the air. Was the number 4 running back last year with 313.7 fantasy points in half-point PPR scoring formats. If Alvin Kamara was alone, if there was no Latavius Murray, he would be the number 1 back. I really do believe that. He's an incredible running back, but that's not the case. That's not our particular situation. Alvin Kamara, he's going to see a lot of work on the ground. He's potentially going to see a lot of work in the red zone because that's where he's most comfortable, and that's what presents to him a lot of value. Last season, had the second most rushing, or he tied for the second most rushing attempts with, I think he had the second most. Yeah, he had the second most rushing attempts, one more than Saquon Barkley last season with 51 rushing attempts, 12 rushing touchdowns, 26 targets for 21 receptions in the red zone, and 3 receiving touchdowns. So 15 of his 18 total touchdowns last season came in the red zone. So that's already the New Orleans Saints committing to Alvin Kamara. When we get down in the red zone, you're in the game. We don't have to worry about Latavius Murray coming in and vulturing anything. Yes, he's been known to do so. He's been a guy that in Minnesota, in Oakland, has vulture touchdowns, has come in and been that goal line back and just plunged himself up the middle. That's not going to happen. I don't believe that's going to affect Alvin Kamara. And this season, 2019, he's my number 4 running back. All right, let's talk about the rest of the guys here. Now, as we continue to move on, obviously they lose value. And it's kind of glaring where they lose value. Now, Melvin Gordon last season missed a couple games due to injury, MCL injury that kind of plagued him for a little bit of the season. Missed a total of 3 games last year. Now, fantasy-wise, that's going to hurt you. But yet, he still ended as the number 7 running back in half-point PPR scoring formats. The guy had 880 rushing yards, 490 receiving yards, total touchdowns 14, 66 targets, 50 receptions, 10 RB1 performances last season. Now, the concern is obviously with injuries. Can we trust Melvin Gordon to stay healthy? We've seen him throughout his entire career have trouble staying healthy, especially when they continue to use him on a weekly basis, 15 plus touches a week. That's going to hurt you eventually. Now, here's the thing. On top of that, you also have the concern of Austin Eckler. Now, I see that. Okay, it makes sense. You have injury risk, and you have the concerns of Austin Eckler taking touchdowns, receptions. We can dispel that instantly. Austin Eckler's production is completely, outside of Melvin Gordon's. I think both these players, yes, they're both running backs within this offense, but the relationship they have within this offense, they're mutually exclusive, I believe. I think, yes, Melvin Gordon would love to see an extra, 50 rushing attempts per year, maybe an extra 50 targets a year. I'm sure he'd love to see that. But with his, his body of work that he's produced in the last couple seasons, he doesn't even need that. This offense with the Los Angeles Chargers, they've kind of, been pretty impressive the last couple years. Offensively, they score a lot of points. But this past season, we saw them kind of turn to, as soon as you get into the red zone, we're giving Melvin Gordon the ball. As soon as the game starts, we have to set the tone with Melvin Gordon. Forget about Austin Eckler. I think Melvin Gordon right now as the number 5 running back, maybe a little bit controversial, but for me, I'm pretty confident that Melvin Gordon can consistently be an RB1 and produce easily for fantasy owners. Really quickly, I just want to read a couple red zone stats. Last season, obviously, he missed 3 games, so he wasn't even close to the top. He had the 25th most rushing attempts. It's not great. Yet, ridiculous fantasy production. 25 rushing attempts, 8 rushing touchdowns, 8 receptions for 3 receiving touchdowns. So of his 14 total touchdowns, 11 of them coming in the red zone, guys. I'm telling you, this red zone production makes a huge difference. If your running back is getting the work in the red zone, they're going to be, without a doubt, fantasy relevant. And that's Melvin Gordon for you. So let's move on to number 6. Let's talk about James Conner. Now, this is probably the biggest surprise. Melvin Gordon, people can understand. I had him in my top 5 last season. And yeah, if it wasn't for those injuries, he would have ended up there. But that's not the point. Another guy that we're talking about that, this time last season wasn't getting much hype. No one was talking about him. Why? Because he was sitting behind Le'Veon Bell in the Pittsburgh Steelers offense. And because, Le'Veon Bell, the 2 seasons prior, was the number 3 and number 2 running back in fantasy. We didn't really pay much attention. We assumed that Le'Veon Bell would re-sign. That wasn't the case. And James Conner had the entire backfield to himself. 970 rushing yards, 497 receiving yards, a total of 13 touchdowns. Having only played, I think it was 12 or 13 games last season. Later on in the back half of the season, struggled a lot. Had a couple injuries that plagued him, and he missed a couple games there. That even being said, he still had 252 fantasy points for the 6th most points, and he was the 6th ranked running back last season. 6th most points as the running back position, 7 RB1 performances, 4 RB2 performances last season. Now, I really don't see why people don't trust James Conner. This Pittsburgh Steelers offense on a consistent yearly basis, they have been a good offense. Now, okay, Antonio Brown's leaving. That's great. I want Antonio Brown to leave for James Conner. Why? Because the offense opens up more for James Conner to get more work in the passing game and have to get more carries on a weekly basis in order to carry this team. Because that's what's going to happen. You have the number 1 ranked offensive line, the Pittsburgh Steelers do, according to Pro Football Focus in 2018. On top of that, there's no more AB. Fine. Juju Smith is going to get his. We're going to have to find another receiver. But in the meantime, last season, James Conner still had 71 targets and 55 receptions. That is going to break over 100 this season. I am fully confident that it's going to end up being like Le'Veon Bell. They may be thinking, James Conner, hey, he's not really a receiving back. Well, he proved us wrong last season. 55 receptions, 500 yards in 12 games. I mean, come on. That's ridiculous. That's exactly what we want to see, especially from a running back that we're going to draft this high. I think he's the number 6 overall running back last season. He had the 13th most red zone rushing attempts for 34 rushing attempts, 10 rushing touchdowns. I'm just fumbling all. I'm trying to read it and it's a mess. 10 rushing touchdowns, 1 receiving touchdown in the red zone, meaning every single one of its touchdowns came from inside of the red zone, 20 yards in it. And that's where I see James Conner. I don't know. I really do believe that he came out last season and he was producing better than Le'Veon Bell was in that offense. Now, you may be thinking, Antonio Brown not being in this offense is going to slow them down. I really think otherwise. I think it's going to present a lot more value and opportunity for a guy like James Conner in this offense. So let's talk about the next guy. We're talking about David Johnson. Now, a couple weeks back, I had a video about Kyler Murray being the number one running back. Now, that video, it had to do with Kyler Murray to an extent, but it really had to do with the weapons around him and how they are going to improve. Now, I'll kind of reiterate what I thought about that. If you want, you can go check out that video. But last season, David Johnson was the number 10th ranked running back in half-point PPR scoring formats. Had 940 rushing yards, 446 receiving yards, 10 total touchdowns, 221.6 fantasy points. Now, coming into the season, he was probably like the third or fourth ranked running back in 2018, coming off that broken wrist that devastated everybody in 2017. No big deal. We know what David Johnson's capable of. In 2016, 360 plus fantasy points in half-point PPR. The guy was a monster, right? He's consistent. We know what he's capable of. Last season, even with having the worst offensive line, the 32nd ranked offensive line according to Pro Football Focus last season, and being within the bottom 5 of every rushing statistic when it comes to teams, David Johnson was still the number 10 running back in fantasy football. That on top of it, dude, he only had 67 targets for 50 receptions. This is a receiving back. He's probably one of the best receivers on the team. Larry Fitzgerald's getting old. I think David Johnson's the best receiver on this team. With Kyler Murray coming into this offense, adding an extra level of depth to this offense, being able to run the ball at the quarterback position, it opens up the running game. When you have that RPO, which is the run-pass option, that already extends it to where a defensive end on the line of scrimmage has to commit to Kyler Murray. What does that do? That opens up lanes for David Johnson to run. And I see David Johnson being the number 7 running back this season. He's definitely capable of being in that top 5 conversation. He's proven it before at times, but I don't think this Arizona Cardinals team is as talented as they need to be at this moment to end up being, to kind of shift him into that top 5 conversation. This offseason, they've addressed the offensive line. They've brought in a couple old veterans. Not old, but a couple veterans that know what they're doing, that are capable at being productive comparatively to what they had last year. But other than that, they've addressed the offensive position. They brought in a couple guys, couple receivers here and there. It's all going to be up to Kyler Murray. But that being said, David Johnson, my number 7 running back this season. Last season, he had the 18th most red zone rushing attempts. He had 29 total attempts for 7 rushing touchdowns, 6 receptions for 1 receiving touchdown. So 8 of his 10 total touchdowns last season coming in the red zone. Again, speaking of guys like Melvin Gordon, who has to worry about like an Austin Eckler, David Johnson doesn't really have somebody sitting behind him. So I can see the argument, okay, he could be the number 5 running back this season. Because, yeah, Chase Edmonds sits behind him, but Chase Edmonds is not going to get much work in this offense. I 100% doubt that. And I think Kyler Murray, his presence alone, comparatively to a Josh Rosen in this offense, is going to elevate David Johnson to this number 7 spot for me. All right, moving on to number 8. Le'Veon Bell. I mentioned him a little bit earlier when I was talking about James Conner. But here's the thing about Le'Veon Bell. In 2016 and in 2016 and in 2017, Le'Veon Bell was the number 2 and the number 3 fantasy running backs in those respective year in half-point PPR scoring formats. Now, we know what he's capable of. He's taken a year off. Now, you may be thinking, well, does that hurt him potentially taking a year off? He's still in his 20s. I think he's about 28, 29 years old. No worries. He's still going to be capable of producing fantasy-wise, right? He's still healthy. He's a younger running back. Now, the only issue is you're going and you're playing for the Jets. You're not behind the number 1 offensive line in the NFL with the Pittsburgh Steelers. You're sitting behind an offensive line that was pretty lackluster, ranked within the bottom 10 of offensive lines last season. And I think, yeah, they've brought in a couple guys offensively to kind of help Sam Darnold out, including Le'Veon Bell. They brought in like a Jamison Crowder. They brought in Kelechi Osemele, the offensive guard. They've tried to improve this offense, and they've improved the defense probably a little bit more than they needed to. I think they brought in a lot of studs. Maybe it'll eventually help them, but offensively, they don't really have much help. They kind of look similar to what they did last year. Now, what did they do last year? The running back position in fantasy for the New York Jets last year scored a total of 300 fantasy points. That's not bad because I can see Le'Veon Bell getting near that. Now, I don't see him having 100% of the snap share at the running back position. Again, they brought in Ty Montgomery. They already had Elijah McGuire on roster. These are guys that, have proven that they are capable in this league. So along with Le'Veon Bell, they make a pretty decent backfield. Now, Le'Veon Bell is going to lead the backfield without a doubt. He's going to lead by a wide margin. It's not going to even be close. But that being said, they scored about 300 fantasy points last season. No big deal. I think Le'Veon Bell is capable of 280 plus. Now on top of it, you may be thinking, okay, well, the offensive coordinator has changed. The offensive game plan, it's going to be shifted a little bit because they brought in Adam Gase, who was the offensive coordinator and kind of offensive genius of the Dolphins. Now, I say genius, but I say that the most insulting way because I don't like Adam Gase very much. But I can respect that Le'Veon Bell is capable of being a top 8-9 running back in fantasy football this season. Last season with the Dolphins, the running backs, which were Frank Gore, Kenyon Drake, and I think there was one more, the younger guy, Kalen Ballage. Those three guys combined for 310 plus fantasy points. So I think just when it comes to capabilities, this offense is going to be able to produce an RB1. It's going to be Le'Veon Bell. Now, whether he sits at the 12 spot or near the 5 spot or kind of in the middle at this kind of number 8 spot, that's where I see myself most comfortable with taking Le'Veon Bell. I don't think he's going to get the production or the opportunity that he got in Pittsburgh. He doesn't have the team that surrounds him. Yes, he has Sam Darnold, who's going to have to dump him off the ball. But Sam Darnold has found Quincy Enunwa, Chris Herndon, Robbie Anderson is guys that he finds as his safety blanket here or there. But we're just going to have to wait and see. But as of right now, Le'Veon, my number 8. All right, moving on, number 9, Todd Gurley. Now, this is probably the biggest surprise. As a guy that loves Todd Gurley, as a guy that has won fantasy championships because of Todd Gurley, this hurts. This hurts me personally to have to put him here. But as of right now, we don't know where Todd Gurley sits. And if I was drafting today, I would have to take him at number 9. I would take him above guys like Mixon, Cook, Damien Williams, which we'll get to in a little bit. But I don't have much confidence in his knee injury. And where they kind of, I guess, have tracked him to play. As of right now, the way I see it, they've brought in a running back via the draft. And I think Todd Gurley, his fantasy value is ridiculous. Last season, 12 RB1 performances, led all running backs with 342.6 fantasy points. I mean, 1,250 plus rushing yards, 21 total touchdowns. The guy was just an animal. And we know what he's capable of. That all being said, in 14 games. He missed the last 2 games of the season. And he produced that many fantasy points. So he was on pace for being one of the best running back seasons in NFL history, right? It's just, at least in fantasy history. But the knee injury concerns. That's really the big deal. The arthritis, whether or not he's going to be in a committee, whether or not they're going to limit his snaps, that's all in question. So as of right now, I would take Todd Gurley at the number 9, assuming that he's going to split snaps with another running back. I'm still seeing him getting all of the red zone work. I'm still seeing him producing on a weekly basis, but I don't see him completely going out of control, having those 30-plus point fantasy weeks, 25 points a week kind of. I don't see that anymore as of right now. Until I can see that Todd Gurley's fully healthy and capable of being that RB1 that I expect him to be, he's going to sit all the way down here at number 9. This is where I feel most confident with him, and it hurts me a little bit, but so be it. Last season, Todd Gurley had the number 1 most rushing attempts amongst all running backs, 64 rushing attempts for 17 rushing touchdowns, had 9 receptions for 3 receiving touchdowns in the red zones. 20 of his 21 touchdowns came in the red zone. As soon as this Rams offense, who is pretty good, got down to the red zone, I understand in the playoffs they were garbage, but in the regular season they were fantastic. They got to the red zone and they handed off the ball to Todd Gurley. Could see that again this year, but probably at a lesser rate than usual. All right, moving on. Let's talk about Joe Mixon at number 10 as we get to the bottom half of this RB1 conversation. Joe Mixon has come out and said publicly that he wants to see the ball 300-plus times a season, and I think he's capable of it. Last season, 1,100-plus rushing yards, a total of 9 touchdowns, almost 300 receiving yards, having missed 2 games earlier on in the season, had his knee scoped, came back from injury, no big deal, picked up where he left off. Now, I think Joe Mixon, as a Bengals running back, the Bengals are not a great team. We know that. Andy Dalton, sure. AJ Green's hurt every other season, no big deal. But Joe Mixon last season was extremely impressive. And whether or not AJ Green or Andy Dalton were on the field, he was still a consistent running back. In fact, in the games that Andy Dalton and AJ Green were out, both on the IR, Joe Mixon averaged just as many points with them on the field or with them off the field. He averaged about 15 fantasy points on whether they're on and off the field. And that kind of proves to me that, yeah, even with a Jeff Driscoll or a Tyler Boyd being your number one wide receiver, as a Bengals offense, he was still able to produce on a weekly basis when defensive coordinators were coming in thinking, that's the guy we need to focus on because that's who's going to get the ball majority of the time. Didn't matter. He still produced on a weekly basis, similar to what Saquon did last season. Defensive coordinators are coming in trying to stop him. They still can't because he's so good. And I think with the offensive line, they've went out into the draft. The Bengals have acquired a couple offensive linemen that are pretty good talent-wise in the first round, second round, third round. So Joe Mixon, fantasy value, he's in the top 10 conversation in half-point PPR scoring formats. So he's my number 10 this season. Last season, again, he missed 2 games yet. He had the 14th most rushing attempts in the red zone, 32 attempts for 8 rushing touchdowns, 5 receptions in the red zone for a touchdown. So all of his touchdowns coming in the red zone. That's where these running backs find value. So as long as they get a good snap share and get a lot of the opportunity down in the red zone, they're just set up for success. And that's where I see Mixon this season set up for success in my number 10. All right, moving on to the number 11, Dalvin Cook. Now, here's the thing. Dalvin Cook was brought in from Florida State University to be the number 1 running back of this team. In 2017, when he came in, that was pretty much set. Latavius Murray was the backup running back, and earlier on in the first 4 games of the season, Dalvin Cook was the stud of the offense. He was carrying the team, even with Case Keenum at quarterback, which is a different conversation. But anyway, he tore his ACL in 2017. Latavius Murray came in, had over 800 rushing yards, double-digit touchdowns, carried the rest of the season. In 2018, the question was, who is going to be the RB1? Are they going to split snaps? Early and just pretty much regularly, it was Dalvin Cook. But again, he was hit with the injury bug. Now, this is a concern without a doubt. Dalvin Cook hasn't stayed healthy, had a season-ending injury in 2017. This last season had a quad injury that I thought was just completely misdiagnosed to a point. The dude missed almost, I think it was 7 games due to this quad injury. I mean, goodness gracious. On the Yahoo reports that I was getting on a daily basis, it would say, Dalvin Cook is practicing on Wednesday. Dalvin Cook is out. Why the fuck would you make him practice on a Wednesday if eventually he's going to be out? Just give him the week off. Let him stay healthy. That's okay. But anyway, I digress. I'm losing my mind. As a Dalvin Cook owner last year, he pretty much he killed fantasy teams. But this season, I think he can save fantasy teams. As a number 11 running back, a guy that you can grab in the second round, he is going to be the entire offense. I understand you have 2 number 1 wide receivers with an Adam Thielen or Stephon Diggs. Kirk Cousins threw for 30 touchdowns. But in this offense that was absolutely getting torn apart because of how bad their offensive line was and how bad they were rushing the ball, Dalvin Cook brings in an extra level that it just eliminates the factor of the offensive line. He produces because he has talent. Last season, this team ranked amongst the bottom 5 at every relevant rushing statistic when it comes to rushing attempts, rushing yards, rushing touchdowns. They were in the bottom 5. They were ranked around 30 to 27 on a statly basis, but they were just terrible running the ball. And it forced Kirk Cousins to have to throw the ball more, no big deal. But when Dalvin Cook came back from his 7-game little skid where he was injured and then he was playing here and there, he had 5 consecutive 14-plus fantasy point weeks in which he proved later on in the back end of the 2018 season. Offensively, he's a stud. He's a double-digit fantasy point week kind of guy. He works in the passing game. Last season, 49 targets, 40 receptions. A guy that's It's going to see a lot of work in the passing game, and especially because there's no Latavius Murray to come out of nowhere and steal touchdowns or carries. I understand they brought in a running back via the draft. They have Amir Abdullah fucking around in the background. No big deal. Dalvin Cook is my number 11 running back. I think as the solo back of this team, yes, they struggled last season, but they've kind of adjusted. They fixed the offensive line at points, and with a healthy Dalvin Cook, he can be an RB1. He's my number 11. All right. So we've come 40 minutes, goodness gracious. Last running back I want to talk about, Damien Williams. Damien Williams, a lot of you may be thinking, what the hell is Andrew talking about? Let me just put it in perspective. Last season, Kansas City Chiefs running backs scored a total of 373 fantasy points, whether that was Damien Williams, Kareem Hunt, and Spencer Ware. All of them combined scored 373 fantasy points. Now, that is mainly because this Kansas City Chiefs offense is unbelievable. With Patrick Mahomes tearing apart defenses, that only presents more value for the running back position of this offense. Now, Damien Williams is not alone. They brought in Frank Gore, but I mean, not Frank Gore, what the hell? Frank Gore's little brother, what's his damn name? Goodness gracious, the Cleveland back that went to the Jaguars last season, Carlos Hyde. They have Carlos Hyde. He's pretty much Frank Gore Jr., okay? Yes, they have Carlos Hyde, but I'm not worried about him. This is the stat that I keyed in on that really kind of pointed my North Star towards Damien Williams closing out my top 12 running backs for early May. From weeks 14 through 17, so the last 4 weeks of the regular season, and the 2 weeks in the playoffs in which they played against the Colts and the New England Patriots, Damien Williams averaged 21 fantasy points per week. The guy had 10 total touchdowns, 300 plus rushing yards, 33 targets, 28 receptions. I mean, goodness gracious, he was ridiculous. Okay. On top of that, we saw Kareem Hunt earlier on in the season. In the 11 games that Kareem Hunt played with the Kansas City Chiefs, he only averaged 19.7 fantasy points per game in those 11 weeks. Now, I understand 11 weeks compared to 6 weeks, there's a pretty big difference, but Damien Williams was producing on a weekly basis. There's a reason why they stuck with him, and there's a reason why he's going to be this year's RB1 for the Kansas City Chiefs offense. He's a talented running back. I know in years prior with the Miami Dolphins, he didn't get much opportunity. He worked in the passing game here and there, but behind guys like J.J. and Kenyon Drake, he was never given a solid shot to be the lead back in the offense. Now that he's with a high-powered offense such as the Kansas City Chiefs and their number one RB, he has to be in the conversation for being an RB1 in fantasy football. He's my number 12 running back, and I think going into this season with such a high-powered offense, just by proxy, you are going to score a lot of fantasy points. And that's why I have Damien Williams at number 12. Anyway, tell me what you guys think. This is my top 12 running back rankings for the early, very early part of the fantasy football season as we get to 2019. Let me know what you guys think. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and until next time, I'll see you guys later. See you.